I'll just take this one because I don't recognize the name. You may have a Stratosphere alias. But we'll wrap this one up tonight with this question from Ralph Capera. And he writes, with all of the hullabaloo, I like you already, Ralph. In fact, when I saw the name Ralph, I liked you. Is that a Ron Swanson avatar? I bet it is. Anyway, Ralph writes, with all of the hullabaloo surrounding the adding of citizen to our census and adding in the angst of over gerrymandering of districts, identity politics being the forefront of life, what do you think about Trump coming in with a completely redesigned census form? It would have the following questions. What is your address? How many U.S. citizens live at this address? And that's it. We don't know the ethnic makeup of the country. We can't gerrymander. If we don't know the ethnic makeup of the country, we can't gerrymander. Make the whole thing colorblind. Yes, sir. We always talk about stopping things and fighting against things, and this is bad and that's bad, and we believe in individuals and we don't believe in any of this identity politics, and we've always got these negatives. But we need to make it crystal clear. We need to be trumpeting this every day. Conservatives have been calling for a colorblind society for decades. Decades. We think that questions about ethnicity, religion, race, and even name is irrelevant. Scott and I did a Bill Whittle Now about, or maybe it was a right angle, I do lose track sometimes, about computer software that takes police reports and using expert system analysis scrubs any reference to, to gender, race, ethnicity, all of it. And so basically, they're taking whatever built-in bias, and there is some built-in bias, they're taking it out of the system. And I think that's a great idea. And this should be a torch. We should be carrying this torch. Because if we were carrying this torch, we'd put the progressives in a position where they are now. And the position is this. We say that that race shouldn't matter, that everybody should be treated equally. And we think that the way that people should be treated equally is to get rid of all of these racist things on all of these forms and just have it be absolutely colorblind. Well, this applicant, is he black or white? There's no way to tell. We don't know. We have been saying this for 20 years. Why is it that the left is so opposed to this? They're opposed to it because the entire idea of identity politics is to lie to people enough to get them so pissed off that they'll vote for you no matter what. And evidence is evidence. If the progressives really want to live in a society where everybody is treated equally, that's certainly what we want, equality under the law. If that's what your goal is, then why are you so opposed to colorblind census and colorblind application forms and all the rest of it? Why? I'd be looking forward to their answer. What they would probably say is something along the lines of, well, there's been so much injustice done for so many years that that we need to have this racial information so that we can correct this terrible injustice. And then you have to start asking all kinds of questions, not the least of which is, and sex blind too, Laura, good point. Not the least of which is, how is it that if somebody does something unjust to somebody, harms them without cause, how is it that having somebody else harm somebody else without cause makes that right? If a white person commits injustice against a black person in 1862, then how is it possible that having a black person commit an injustice against a white person make that right? Not only did the white person not commit the crime, but the black person didn't suffer from it. They're saying they suffered from it, but we talked about this quite a bit on one of the shows where I do lose track, especially this week with all the other writing I've had to do. We're talking about it was Scott's segment on Right Angle, which is not out yet because of me. We were basically saying that that we should have a positive message for this. And since I'm behind on getting this thumbnail out for this, and we'll get them all finished tomorrow, but basically, I'll just close with this one little story that I mentioned on that Right Angle show. So I think it's important. My mother's side of the family, my grandfather, my mother's father, was awarded the Order of the British Empire. He was an officer in the Royal Navy. He worked with naval intelligence during and after World War II, and was pretty good friends with Ian Fleming. And I was and continue to be filled with a burning pride about this, really burning pride. And so when my cousin Jack, who's about my age, decided to look into our family history, which is much easier on the male side just because of the documents and the names. He went back along the male Whittle line, and I think he got back to 1740. And what he found was that all of us knuckle-dragging ridge runners came from northwestern England. That we're all from a town called Wigham. Wigham has, I don't know how many different Whittles there are in the phone book, but it's astonishingly common. And that's because there is the White Hill region right up there, and that's where the name came from. But when he did the genealogy and broke it down, I got to see the names of everybody, and how long they lived and how big their families were and what they did for a living. And we are mill workers and coal miners back to prehistory. And when I first discovered this, I will admit there was a minute, probably more than a minute, when I was like, really? You know, a bunch of coal miners. And then I almost immediately I just completely reversed myself. It's like, again, it's like I said, it's like slap myself in the face, It's like, what's the matter with you, Bill? If you had been descended from a duke and you're sitting here, trying to pull together the money to keep the electric bill on and pay the rent on the studio, that would be a long fall. But you're descended from coal miners and mill workers. And Martin Archer beat me to the punch. And they suffered so that I wouldn't have to. Some of the things, strangely enough, Orwell wrote a book called The Road to Wigan Pier, talked about the neighborhood that my ancestors came from. And the squalor of that neighborhood in the 1930s, by the way, my family left there in 1915. But the squalor of those housing conditions were the match for any slum in the world at any time in history. Far worse than the conditions on a slave plantation. And if you want to get down to that, it's not like these people could leave. They were not legally owned by the company, that's true, but they couldn't leave. They couldn't just up and go. They had to do what they had to do, work for these people at whatever they decided to pay them, and they paid them just enough to stay alive. It is a form of economic slavery. It's not the same. I'm not pretending it's the same, but nevertheless. So here's the thing. Once I realized this, in this book, Road to Wigan Pier, he talks about miners, coal miners. And he said some things that I hadn't realized. For example, a coal miner for the first shift would have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and then they would go down the shaft into the coal mine, and this never occurred to me at all. Anybody here ever walk? I mean, some people do more walking than others. You ever walk a mile? A mile's a decent walk. It's not a killer walk by any means, but a mile is, a mile's a walk. When they got to the bottom of the pits, they would have to walk for 2 or 3 miles, hunched over, under a 3-foot ceiling, to get to where the face of the coal is. And they weren't paid for the time. They weren't paid unless they were chopping coal. They had to walk underground under a 3-foot ceiling, bent in half, for 2 miles to get to start to work. And the same thing coming home, too. Merlin says that his wife and he walk 2 miles every other day. Well, just as a kick, I'm not trying to be nasty here, but try it bent in half and tell me how that works. And all of these little details that Orwell wrote about, these are the things that bring it to life. He said that a lot of these miners looked like their faces had been tattooed. They almost looked like Maori warriors. And the reason that they looked like that was because as they're hitting this coal seam with pickaxe, and by the way, they're working these picks on their knees. They're working a pick for 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day on their knees. And what was happening is when they would hit the face of the coal with the pick, these razor sharp chips of coal would fly off and constantly put little cuts on their faces. And because there was so much coal dust in the air, this coal got into the wound, under the wound, and when the wound healed over, it was a tattoo. It was a subcutaneous pigment in there. And their faces were just streaked with blue-black, which was coal dust that had gotten into the open face wounds that they got every day. And then when they became mill workers, people would say, how could you ever work in a mill, in a cotton mill? I have 3 generations of ancestors who were cotton carders. I've talked about this before, but cotton carding was something you had to do in a cotton mill where they would give a guy a piece of raw cotton, just like a hunk of cotton off of the bale. And I had 2 or 3 generations of grandfathers who had like wooden blocks about this big with leather straps on the sides so that they had, it's like they had 2 iPads glued to their hands. And these wooden panels had these little tiny metal hooks, kind of like the things you use to groom a dog. And they would give this person a hunk of cotton, and then they would take this hunk of cotton and they would do this. And what they're doing is they're aligning the threads and they're knocking out the little seeds. And they would do this for 7 or 8 minutes. And I've been doing it for 15 seconds, and already my arm is starting to give me trouble about it. It's just not like I can't do it anymore, just not fun. And they would do that 6 days a week for 10 hours a day for 30 years. And you ask yourself, how is it possible that somebody could do a job like that? How? And then you realize that a job like that is a step up. It's a big improvement over being a coal miner. They had the coal mines, the cruelty of first stage capitalism, especially in England, it really is astonishing. The miners took care of themselves. They set up their own funds for guys who were injured who couldn't work again and so on. But the company really was just, it's like the White Star Line, when the Titanic went down, universally remembered among the heroes of that night was the band. They were, once it was 7 or 8 musicians, and they were freelancers. They weren't hired. They were contracted out by White Star Line, and these guys could have gone. They weren't ship's company. They weren't on the ship's company register. They were not employees. They were independent contractors. And these 7 or 8 musicians, I want to say it was 8, could have made a run for their lives and had some chance of survival, but they decided, after the leader, whose name I keep forgetting, and I am embarrassed that I've forgotten his name. I can see his face. Somebody will tell me what it is in a second. But they decided to go back on deck. The leader went out there with his violin, and every one of the other 7 members of the band went out there on the deck with their instruments and played music for an hour. Wallace Hartley. Thank you. Doffers, Astronerd says they were called. Okay, so Wallace Hartley decides, rather than a chance to live, he's going to stay here and suffer certain death, because he figures that he can comfort a lot of these people by playing music to soothe their nerves at the time of this panic. So this band is playing there for over an hour, I think, until finally the ship goes into the ocean. Every single one of them drowns. Every one of them. And after this was over, and after this story was told, White Star Line billed the families of these musicians for the cost of their uniforms. I'm not making it up. I'm not making it up. They not only did not provide any kind of support or any kind of compensation. They billed the families of these working musicians for the uniforms that were not returned because they're at the bottom of the ocean, along with the musicians who stayed there voluntarily. And when I hear things like that, I just think to myself, that no wonder communism had a following in the late 1800s, early 1900s. I mean, it's inconceivable. Forget as a business practice, it's inconceivable as a human being. What kind of person can write that letter? Anyway, it's the whole thing is just incredible. But back to the whole coal mining thing. My ancestors were coal miners back into history. There were about 6 or 7 generations where they were mill workers and cotton carters. Big step up. And as we're coming forward into the present now, moving forward in time, then there were 1 or 2 generation of plumbers. I think maybe 1 generation of like a haberdasher hat company, but I know plumbers for 2 generations. And then my grandfather, who I never met, came to America in 1915, and he went from being a plumber to being a telephone lineman, which was cutting-edge technology in 1915. He's working in the tech industry. He met my grandmother, who was a telephone operator, stayed a telephone. She was the switchboard operator for Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, until she dropped. And then their son, my father, was a hotel manager, and here I am, internet pundit. So my Aunt Marty told me about her father, who's also the same as my grandfather, and said that he'd always wanted to be a writer and that he was actually a pretty good writer. And she gave me some of his stuff, and he was a good writer, my grandfather, who I never met. But my grandfather was out there in February at dawn hanging telephone wires in Pennsylvania because he had a family to feed. He could not afford the luxury of being a writer. And I can. So I'm writing for him. And all of them. I'm doing all of this for all the coal miners and all of the mill workers and all of them. This is why modern society is in such trouble. This fundamental thing, I think this is really, really boiled down to it. This is the ultimate thing. All of it. All of the problems, all crime, drug use, all of it comes down to this. We no longer are willing to make sacrifices so that our children's lives are going to be better. When I say we, I don't mean the people listening to this, but I mean as a society. We are no longer willing to do anything. People went into coal mines because they had families of 11 kids and they had to feed them. And they worked in mills doing this mind-destroying carpal tunnel repetitive work for years to feed the family. And whatever it took, they did, whatever it took. I've told this story before. I'll close with it. I just think it's interesting. It's one of these things like the little tattoos on the face that bring home the reality of that life to you. When it came time to take a bath in these slums, these row slums, a lot of them didn't have their own toilet. A lot of them had a common toilet out back. So if you're gonna take a bath, it's not like you just step into the bathroom and turn on the hot water. You have to go down to the pump and get the water, and then bring it upstairs into the bathroom, and you have to heat the water. And so that water had to be heated over either a cold fire stove or something like this. And even if you used a large container, a big tea kettle or something, you're only able to heat a certain amount of water at any given time. By the time you pour that into the bathtub and you get the next round done, the water's cold. But anyway, running a hot bath in 1914 for mill workers or coal miners was a big deal. And that's why they did it once a week. And since they could take one bath a week in those iron standing bathtubs, you would think, given our current ethics, that Dad would go last, and the kids would go first. No, Dad was the one whose skin was turning blue from coal dust. He had to have the hot water. He had to have it. If it wasn't hot and relatively hot anyway, then he would not. He wouldn't get any of it off. So Dad gets into the bathtub first, and he scrubs with lye soap and stuff, and gets this week's worth of coal dust out of his pores, out of his hair, all of it. So he gets out of the bathtub, and needless to say, bathtub's in pretty bad shape. Then Mom takes a bath, and then every one of the kids, one by one, takes a bath. 11 of them. And by the time they get to the last kid, to the baby, the water in the bath is not only cold, it's black as ink. It is India ink black. And the water was so opaque that if you were washing the baby last and you forgot about it, you could throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's where that expression came from. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. The reason that makes sense when they wrote it and doesn't make any sense today. What does it mean, throw the baby out with the bathwater? You can't fit a baby down a drain. No, but in those days when you had to empty a tub of water that was absolutely black, you could lose a baby in there. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. That was life. And it just tells me that progress in civilization and healthy societies are generated by people who are trying to make a bad situation better for their kids. And once the situation for their kids becomes unimprovable, essentially, then there's no reason to do this anymore. And then that just goes away. And you're left with nothing but narcissism and selfies. Until it collapses, at which point people start having a lot of kids because that's your retirement plan. You're not getting Social Security and you don't have an IRA. If society collapses, if you're going to live to be, the ripe old age of maybe 40, you'd better have a bunch of kids ready to work for you and feed you when you can't anymore. And this is it. It's today's young people live under the asymptote. One of the first arguments to make, I love it. An exponential curve is one that does this. It increases rapidly over time to the point where it's a vertical line, and you can never actually get there. Asymptotic line is the exact opposite. It starts out going up high very, very quickly, and then as time continues, it gets lesser. It climbs higher and higher at a smaller and smaller rate, till eventually it becomes so flat that it doesn't actually reach the margin. So this generation is born under the asymptote. And what that means to me is 2 generations ago, or 3 at the most, if Dad worked like a slave, he might get electricity in the house, or hot running water, or both. Going from having to haul those buckets up to being able to turn on a faucet and have hot water come out, that is an enormous increase in the quality of life for you and the entire family. But how do you do that for a millennial? I'm not picking on them by name now. I'm just saying, as a person of that age, as a person, young millennials now, because some of the older ones are in their 30s. But if you're a 17, 18-year-old kid today, how do you produce that level of increase in the quality of life? How do you improve the quality of life, and what would motivate you to work that hard in order to lift the quality of life of kids who have never been hungry, never been cold, never known any pain at all that wasn't accidentally caused and alleviated in the half hour it took them to get to the ambulance or the hospital. They've never been bored. They've never had to sit and think about things. They've never been out of contact with anybody. How do you improve that person's life? It's not possible. All you can do is make the luxuries marginally better. And then what happens is, the real reason that this socialism is so popular and getting more popular every day is because they haven't had to work for anything. they've never had to work for anything. They've never, generally speaking, had to do anything even really unpleasant. Certainly not for years and years and years. And so if you never worked for your money, then money's just a thing that's out there that got scattered over the land by the wealth fairy, and it's not fair that some more landed on some people than it did on others. It's just not fair. Of course they don't value money. Of course they're ready to go for socialism because they haven't had to earn money in the way that we have. And I don't personally know, I know they're in the military and so on. I personally don't know any millennials that ever did a job that they thought was, a lot of them did jobs that they didn't like, but any job that you would consider to be like unpleasant, and I'm talking about things like security guard or limo driver or something like that. They don't toil, says Woody Fool. That's good. They won't brook inconvenience. That's right. If the job becomes less than fun, they quit. Because they can. Because they can. And any of our parents and our ancestors would have done it too. If you can do nothing, that's what people will do. It's how they're built. And we reached the point out of the hard work of so many generations that now our kids don't have to do anything. And they can stay at home. Their quality of life doesn't fundamentally change. In a lot of ways, it's easier for them. They don't have to deal with the stress of paying bills and stuff. They just go back and live with their parents. Maybe they went to college, maybe they didn't. But what's the harm? It's not like they're starting their own families. It's not like they've got 5 kids in the spare room or in the basement. They're just eternal children. And that's the thing that is the greatest crime against these millennials. It's so hard for me. I'm getting much better at it, but it took a while for me to constantly remind myself that the millennials didn't ask for this. This was not what they asked for. This was imposed upon them. But what do they do? You know? How do you connect people to this? And because they never have to do, and this is the point, because they never have to do anything unpleasant, they never really earn anything. Not in the way that it means I don't pretend that I earned anything even remotely close to what my coal miners or mill worker ancestors did. Nothing I have ever done in my life comes close to being nearly as bad as the day they had to deal with every day. But I've had to do a lot of jobs I didn't like, a lot of jobs. Office temp at insurance companies, and I was a limo driver for 3 years and lifting bags from people who were 10 years younger than me into the back of limousines, and I was a security guard, and I was on the night shift. And I had to walk around this building starting at 11 o'clock at night until 7 o'clock in the morning and just turn these little keys and eat my frozen TV dinner for half an hour in the back room there, and boom. And it's not anything like what my ancestors went through, but it wasn't fun. It wasn't a choice that I would have made. I just had to do it because if I didn't, I wasn't going to college. And they don't ever have to do that. And since they never had to do that, how are they ever going to appreciate the fact that they could make a living talking into a camera? How could that mean anything to them? They've grown up talking into the camera. This is the floor for them. I know Scott and Steve and I, Scott especially because we do the extra show together and all the other stuff that Scott does for us. We just constantly can you believe we're getting away with this? We are getting away with it, but we earned it. Both of us earned it. And this is the part that I feel most sad about for the millennials. Because they've never had to undergo hardship or unpleasantness or do anything dreary or grinding except in video games, grinding in video games. But they've never had to do really nasty stuff or even remotely unpleasant stuff. And so since they never had to suffer during those periods and keeping their eye on the reward, they will never know, ever. They cannot know the fundamental joy that you get from achieving something. They can't have it. They can't have it not because they're not capable of doing something. They can't have it because they were never, ever forced to do something that they didn't want to do and have something to compare it to. It's child abuse. It's child abuse. Um, and and it's just terribly, terribly sad. Really, really tragic. Um, Steve says, do they know what they're missing? They don't, Steve. They don't know what they're missing. It kind of ties back to the space age thing again. But they don't know what they're missing. They never had to want it. There's nothing more cruel than giving a child, and I'm not saying this is true for everybody, but I mean, just the only examples prior to this current generation were trust fund kids. I have never known a trust fund kid whose parents were really spectacularly wealthy. I've never known one of them that turned out even kind of okay. And the reason they didn't turn out kind of okay even is because they're dilettantes at everything. Everything's just kind of a whim. Everything's kind of a hobby. They never had to go to work, ever. And so they'll never know what it's like to have the kind of job that's not work. I haven't gone to work in 12 years. Which would explain the delay on the videos. But just think about that. It is impossible for them to experience that joy and ecstasy of success and achievement because they have never, not that they can't do things, it's just that they have never had to suffer through the hardship that gives it perspective and meaning. And I don't know what the answer to that is. I was getting some dinner 2 nights ago, and I stopped at Five Guys for a cheeseburger. I just shot the first of these segments that you saw the still from earlier, and this family walked in, and they're standing next to each other, ordering, and every single one of them are down here playing. The 2 kids are playing like, Candy Crush kind of video games and stuff, and mom is texting somebody. And then they walked over and they got their drinks, and this kid got this drink and nearly ran into me because he's navigating his way through this restaurant, but he's still playing this game. And then they sit down over there, and I look at them, and they don't say a word to each other, and they might as well be on different planets, and they're not even doing anything constructive. I mean, it's not even that they're building any kind of skills or anything. I mean, they're just moving geometric shapes around. And I'm just thinking to myself, somebody please, I don't believe in this whole child protective services thing, but would somebody please, please, please take these kids into the mountains and put them in a cabin for a month with no internet, please? I don't know if they'd survive it. I was close to In-N-Out. Kulak76 says, Five Guys not bad if you weren't close to an In-N-Out. I had to drive past an In-N-Out to get to Five Guys. But In-N-Out in California is a half-hour wait just to order. So, anyway. There you go. Merlin, being kind, says, someday that kid could say, hey, I ran into Bill Whittle at a restaurant. He won't say that. Not only will he not know who I am, I appreciate the thought, but he won't know he ran into me because he never saw me. We were just in the same room together, 3 feet away for half an hour. Anyway, the discussion now turns on which is better, Five Guys and In-N-Out. I prefer Five Guys, frankly, but mostly because I'm a fan of the peanuts. Peanuts, I said. Texas Roadhouse used to have that, scoop up a big old thing of peanuts and just eat them while they're waiting for your food to come. And every time I did it, by the time the steak got there, I was like, damn, I'm hungry. Don't need any more. All right, guys. almost 3 hours, 2 hours, 45 minutes. I spent a whole lot of the first time doing that. For those of you members who are watching or either recorded or live, I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to take more questions from there. I will be doing more and more of that as time goes on. The questions are very, very good, and I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to get to all of them, but we'll set up one of those every week. And we'll do some from Facebook too, I guess. But in any event, this program is brought to you by the paying members of BillWhittle.com. And you know who you are. And this is all possible because of you. So thank you very much. And for those of you new members, we had quite a few new members recently. If you're one of those people, thank you, welcome, and be sure to introduce yourself on the website. You will not believe the quality of the people that are here. Which reminds me, I got a chance to use my favorite tech joke in the world. Yesterday I was working with this gigantic crew. I've told this before too, but who cares? When we were working at PJTV, the executive producer came in, Owen Brennan, and he was getting ready to leave, and the whole staff got together to say goodbye to him, and he told everybody how much fun he had and how proud he was of the work he did. And when he finished, he said, I'd rather work with you guys than with the best people in the world. And I just thought that was just the greatest line ever. I'd rather work with you guys than with the best people in the world. It makes so much sense. Anyway, Warped Factor says he's new here. Cool name. In any event, thank you for your support. And it means the world to us. And we're doing our very best with it. And I expect we'll be doing a lot more with it.